In the coming years, climate change could force hundreds of millions of people to leave their homes.
One of the worst blazes has already forced more than 6,000 people from their homes.
Those in the poorest regions of the world will be the most affected.
Climate change is not an abstract notion for these islands.
Many of these climate migrants will cross borders and continents. But it's anticipated the majority will move much shorter distances and stay within their own countries.
Families who've lost their homes are sleeping on the roadside.
Countries and governments should be planning in advance for these mass migrations. The problem is, most aren't.
A lot of communities will simply die.
So why isn't the world doing enough to prepare for climate migration? And what can be done to manage this crisis better?
It is a moral obligation.
I feel like I was being separated from where I belong. So it's just like two pieces of Velcro, you know.
It doesn't sit too easy with me. So much of me is still down there on Isla Jean Charles.
In the summer of 2022, Chris Brunet took the momentous decision to leave his home on Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana. His tribe, the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw Indians, have lived there for nearly 200 years.
That sign says, Isla Jean Charles is not dead and climate change sucks.
Climate change gave Chris and most of his community no real choice but to leave their ancestral land.
I really didn't want to leave.
Well, I felt like that's the decision I had to make.
Chris's former home is no longer safe for human habitation. Rising sea levels mean the island is losing land, which used to be a crucial buffer that protected the houses from storms. As that buffer disappears, the impact of hurricanes is now much worse.
Whenever you look at the damage to the island, there's some people, their homes were destroyed, and so they had no more home to live in.
More than 2,000 square miles of land in Louisiana has disappeared since the 1930s, equivalent to roughly one American football field every hour. Ile de Jean Charles is at the forefront of this catastrophe. But in its wake could be a model for helping people caught in a similar predicament. After life on the Isle became untenable for residents like Chris, they asked the state of Louisiana to help them. And in a groundbreaking policy move, the federal government paid for 37 families to relocate to new homes 40 miles away here on the new Isle.
When it comes to comparing this one here to my house that I have on the island, the house on the island is one, I was raised in, and so I'm used to that one. And so I know this one here is totally different than what I'm, was used to. But what is helping me with that is that I am surrounded by the people that were my neighbors.
Moving Chris's community is one of the first examples of a state using federal funds to relocate victims of climate change en masse. This kind of planned migration is a bold idea, known as managed retreat. What sets this idea apart from evacuation is that managed retreat is planned in advance. And, crucially, there could be more of this type of climate migration in future across the world. It could help poor parts of the rich world, and in particular, large swathes of the developing world.
Those who are left behind may be the most needy and the most vulnerable. Those are the ones who are probably going to need assistance to move.
The trouble is, even in the rich world, most governments haven't got round to making any plans to move communities. Moving people is incredibly expensive. Louisiana spent nearly $50 million of federal funds to move just 100 or so people, which means poor countries are in a really perilous position. If the planet warms between 2 and 2.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, more and more parts of the world will become uninhabitable. and the majority of those places will be in the developing world. Estimates for the numbers of climate migrants depend on how much global temperatures rise. But one continent will feel the heat more than any other.
Here in Africa, home to many nations considered most vulnerable to climate change.
The African continent is the continent that will be the most impacted by the climate crisis. And the shocks will affect population in a unique way. Up to 5% of Africa's population by 2050 will be forced to move purely as a result of the climate crisis.
In a worst-case scenario, with more than 3 degrees of warming, that could mean more than 100 million people being forced to move. The populations of entire cities in Africa could be at risk. But right now, it's hard to imagine who would put the resources into planning and paying for these mass migrations.
In big cities, particularly such as Lagos, Alexandria, or Dakar, it will be very difficult to be done. And to be done properly, it will require significant resources.
Where and how managed retreat should be planned varies across the world, depending on geography and other factors. But one constant is that international funding and assistance are needed on a large scale.
It is time for the global north to rise.
And this would require a big change in mindset in the rich world.
As the saying goes, it takes two hands to clap. The global north, the historical polluters, have a responsibility to work with these specific communities and to support and assist when it comes to managed retreat.
Cost isn't the only obstacle to planning mass migrations. Making long-term plans to move entire communities doesn't have much appeal at the ballot box. Politicians in all countries, rich and poor, tend to be more interested in short-term election cycles.
Nobody wants to move, and mayors and local authorities in particular are reluctant to even suggest the possibility that a whole community may have to move because of the effects of climate change. This is politically not popular.
Moving any community within a country is a hard enough sell. But what happens when a whole country needs to move? At least 5 island nations could face partial submersion due to rising sea levels by 2100. In the worst case, it's estimated that some 2 million people will be affected. But despite the warnings of climate scientists, planned relocation is a possibility that the international community is proving slow to face up to.
It will be very sad that the international community is not able to provide a solution to these nations and to these communities which have had no finger in the climate crisis. The climate crisis will remake who they are, where they are, and how they live.
Many of the disagreements about finding a solution will be about money. But no matter who pays, it's important that the country moving can control its own destiny.
If in fact whole countries do have to move, they should be the ones to negotiate where and how and under what conditions they do move.
For this to happen, it's best to start discussions early, as some states are trying to do. The island of Tuvalu might become one of the first countries to lose its entire landmass to climate change. But there's little thought being given to where its inhabitants will go, despite their pleas growing ever more urgent.
In Tuvalu, we are living the realities of climate change, sea level rise. We must take bold, alternative action today.
Right now, the focus of most governments in the rich world is on measures which eliminate emissions, like renewable energy, and on adaptive actions, like building flood defences. But they should also be planning how and where to move affected populations.
When it comes to relocation, it is definitely more manageable, it is cheaper, it is scope of success much higher if you do it well in advance, if you plan it.
Planning ahead will save governments money, but it'll also be kinder to the people who will have to bear the brunt of the climate crisis.
Managed retreat should not be looked at solely from the financial point of view. It is not only about moving people from point A to point B, it is about building that inner resilience for these communities to be able to continue to be productive, to continue to be hopeful, and to continue to be at peace with itself and the climate crisis.
Hello, I'm Tom Standage, Deputy Editor at The Economist. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, click on the link opposite. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.